The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Tucumcari, New Mexico, when Margaret Wallace discovered her husband had died owing more money than she had ever seen in her entire 24 years of life. She stood in the doorway of the cramped general store her late husband Thomas had run into the ground, clutching a stack of papers that represented debts to nearly every merchant and businessman within 100 miles. The banker, a pinched-faced man named Silas Greenwood, had delivered them himself that morning with a mixture of pity and calculation in his watery eyes. Thomas had been dead only 3 days, killed when his horse spooked and threw him against a fence post, breaking his neck instantly. Margaret had barely had time to grieve before the vultures descended. "Mrs. Wallace, I am sorry for your loss, truly I am," Greenwood had said, though his words carried all the warmth of a rattlesnake. "But business is business. These debts must be settled. I will give you 2 weeks to gather what you can, and then I am afraid I will have no choice but to seize the store and everything in it. Everything in it." Margaret looked around the dusty shelves, half empty from Thomas's poor management and worse gambling habits. He had been a charming man when he wanted to be, with bright eyes and quick words that had swept her off her feet when she was barely 19. But charm did not pay bills, and his promises of prosperity had dissolved like morning dew under the harsh New Mexico sun. Now she stood alone in 1878, a widow with no family, no money, and debts that totaled more than $400. She had spent the past 2 days trying to calculate what the store's inventory might fetch, but the numbers never added up to anything close to what was owed. The building itself belonged to the bank. The living quarters upstairs, where she had spent 5 years of increasingly desperate marriage, would be lost along with everything else. She had perhaps $20 in actual cash, a few pieces of simple jewelry that had belonged to her mother, and the clothes on her back. The realization sat in her stomach like a stone. Margaret moved through the store mechanically, dusting shelves that hardly needed it, rearranging cans and boxes in patterns that made no difference. The bell above the door chimed occasionally as customers wandered in, mostly to offer awkward condolences before purchasing a few small items. She smiled and thanked them, her face aching from the effort of maintaining composure. What would happen to her when the 2 weeks ended? She had no skills beyond keeping house and minding the store. Perhaps she could find work as a seamstress or a laundress, though those positions were scarce and poorly paid. The thought of ending up in one of the saloons, serving drinks to rough men or worse, made her throat tighten with panic. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when the door opened again, and a man entered who made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. He was massive, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the doorway. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, sun-streaked and slightly wild. He wore buckskin clothing that showed the hard muscle of his arms and chest, and his face was weathered and strong-featured, with a square jaw darkened by several days of beard growth. His eyes, a startling gray-blue, swept the store before landing on Margaret with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble. He removed his hat, revealing more of that thick, dark hair. "I heard Thomas Wallace passed. I came to pay my respects and settle my account." Margaret blinked, trying to place him. "Your account? Name's Mason Hughes. I trapped through here last winter and spring. Your husband extended me credit for supplies. I have been up in the mountains these past months and only just heard the news." He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small bag that clinked heavily. "I owe $42. I believe that was the amount we agreed upon. $42. Margaret stared at the bag he placed on the counter as if it were a mirage. I am sorry, Mr. Hughes. I have no record of this debt. His expression did not change. I would not expect you to. Thomas and I shook hands on it, but a debt is a debt and I pay what I owe. He pushed the bag toward her. Count it if you like, it is all there. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the bag and saw the glint of gold and silver coins inside. She looked up at Mason Hughes, this mountain of a man who had walked into her store like something from a different world. This is very generous of you, sir. Especially when you need not have come at all. I would never have known. I would have known, he said simply. His eyes studied her face, and she saw something shift in his expression. Forgive me for being forward, madam, but you look like you are carrying more than grief. The unexpected kindness in his tone broke something loose inside her. To her horror, Margaret felt tears well up in her eyes. She turned away quickly, pressing her palms against the counter. I apologize. I should not burden a stranger with my troubles. Sometimes strangers are easier to talk to than friends, Mason said quietly. He did not move closer, giving her space. And I have been told I am a good listener. Margaret took a shaky breath. What did it matter if she told him? In 2 weeks, everyone in Tucumcari would know her shame anyway. My husband left debts, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Over $400. The bank is seizing the store. I have nothing. Silence fell, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. When Margaret finally gathered the courage to turn around, she found Mason Hughes watching her with an expression she could not quite read. His jaw was tight, and those gray-blue eyes had gone hard as flint. How much time did they give you? He asked. 2 weeks from yesterday. He nodded slowly, his gaze traveling around the store as if calculating something. And you have family? Somewhere to go? No. My parents died of fever when I was 17. Thomas was all I had. The admission made her feel even more pathetic, but it was the truth. Mason was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that made Margaret wonder if the stress had finally broken her mind. I will pay it. She actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Mr. Hughes, that is very kind, but I cannot accept charity from a stranger. And $400 is a fortune. It is not charity. He met her eyes directly. I am making you a business proposition. A business proposition, Margaret repeated numbly. Yes, madam. I have been trapping and trading in these mountains for near about 8 years now. I have done well for myself, saved my money, but I am getting tired of living out of a tent and eating nothing but dried meat and whatever I can shoot. I have been thinking it is time to settle down, maybe start a business in town. He gestured around the store. This seems like as good a place as any. Margaret's mind raced, trying to understand what he was suggesting. You want to buy the store, in a manner of speaking. I will pay off your debts, clear the title. In exchange, you agree to stay on and run the place. You know the business, know the customers. I know trading and I know what sells in the mountains and plains. We would be partners. It was too much, too fast. Margaret pressed her fingers to her temples. Mr. Hughes, I appreciate what you are trying to do, but this makes no sense. You do not know me. I could be a terrible businesswoman. I could run off with your money. A hint of a smile touched his stern features. Could you? No, she admitted. But you have no way of knowing that. I am a fair judge of character, Mrs. Wallace. Have to be in my line of work. And I can see you are honest. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. I can also see you are scared and alone, and that no woman deserves to be put on the street because her husband was a fool with money. If you want to call it charity, fine. But I would prefer to call it a business arrangement between two people who might be able to help each other. Margaret stared at this stranger, who had walked into her life at its darkest moment and offered her a lifeline. Part of her wanted to refuse, to cling to her pride even as it dragged her under. But a larger part, the practical part that had kept her going through 5 years of disappointment and struggle, knew that pride was a luxury she could not afford. "I would need to pay you back," she said, lifting her chin. "Every cent. I would not be beholden." "We can work out terms," Mason agreed. "Fair wages for running the store with a portion going toward the debt until it is cleared, and we put everything in writing, legal and proper." "Why?" The question burst out of her. "Why would you do this for someone you do not even know?" Mason was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I had a sister once," he said finally. "She married a man who seemed decent enough, but he drank and he gambled, and when he died, he left her with nothing. She had no one to help her. She ended up—" He stopped, his jaw working. "She ended up in a bad way. She died 2 years later, so maybe I am doing this for her in a manner of speaking. Maybe I am doing it because I can and because it is the right thing to do. Does the reason matter so much?" Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, but this time she did not turn away. "It matters to me," she whispered. "It matters that someone would care." The next days passed in a blur of activity. Mason Hughes proved to be a man of his word. He met with Silas Greenwood at the bank, and Margaret accompanied him, watching in amazement as he counted out the full sum of her debts in gold and silver. Greenwood's expression had been priceless, shifting from surprise to poorly concealed disappointment. He had clearly been looking forward to seizing the store and its contents. "I will need a receipt for every penny," Mason had said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I will need the deed to the store property transferred to my name, free and clear." Greenwood had sputtered about procedures and waiting periods, but Mason had simply leaned forward across the desk, his massive frame suddenly seeming even larger. "I am sure you can expedite things, Mr. Greenwood. After all, I am paying in cash, which is more than most folks can say. I would hate to think you were dragging your feet for some reason." The deed had been transferred within 3 days. Mason also insisted on drawing up a formal contract between himself and Margaret, outlining her responsibilities, managing the store, and her wages, which were more generous than she had expected. $25 a month plus room and board, with $15 going toward repaying the debt he had cleared on her behalf. At that rate, it would take her years to repay him, but he had waived off her concerns. "I am in no hurry," he had said, "and if the store does well, we can renegotiate." Margaret threw herself into the work with renewed energy. She took inventory of everything in the store, noting what was selling and what was gathering dust. Mason proved to be an invaluable partner. He knew which goods were in demand among the trappers, hunters, and traders who passed through Tucumcari. He also had connections with suppliers that Thomas had never cultivated. Within 2 weeks, the store had more stock than it had seen in 2 years, and customers who had drifted away during Thomas's mismanagement began returning. Mason stayed in a room at the boarding house down the street, but he was at the store every day from dawn until dusk. Margaret found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, and she noticed how customers responded to him. Men respected his quiet competence and directness. Women, particularly the unmarried ones and a few of the bolder married ones, found excuses to come in and flutter their eyelashes at him. He was always polite but distant, never encouraging their attentions. Margaret told herself she had no right to feel a flutter of satisfaction at his lack of interest in other women. He was her business partner, nothing more. He had helped her out of kindness, and perhaps to assuage his own guilt over his sister's fate. The fact that she found herself thinking about him at odd moments, noticing the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he lifted heavy crates, or the way his rare smiles transformed his stern features, was nothing more than natural gratitude mixed with loneliness. But as weeks turned into months, Margaret could not deny that something was shifting between them. It started with small things. Mason began staying for supper in the upstairs living quarters, and they would talk long into the evening about the store, about Tucumcari, about their lives. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about heading west after his parents died, about learning to trap and survive in the wilderness. She told him about her childhood in Kansas, about losing her parents, about the naive hope she had carried into her marriage. "I thought love would be enough," she admitted one evening in late October. They were sitting at the small table by the window, the remains of a simple meal between them. "I thought if I just tried hard enough, made him happy enough, things would work out." "It was not your fault," Mason said quietly. "Some men are just weak. They want things to be easy, and when they are not, they look for escapes instead of solutions. Were you ever married?" The question slipped out before Margaret could stop it. "I am sorry, that is too personal." "It is all right." Mason took a sip of his coffee. "No, never married. Came close once, about 6 years back. There was a woman in Santa Fe, a widow running a restaurant. We courted for a while, but in the end, she decided she wanted someone more settled. Someone who did not disappear into the mountains for months at a time. Cannot say I blamed her." "Do you regret it?" He considered the question. "I regret hurting her, but I do not regret the choice. I was not ready to settle down then. Maybe I would have made her as miserable as she would have made me." His eyes met hers across the table. "Timing matters, I think. Meeting the right person at the wrong time is no better than meeting the wrong person." Margaret's heart beat faster. Was there meaning in his words, or was she reading too much into a simple observation? She stood quickly, gathering the dishes. "I should clean up. You have an early morning tomorrow." Mason stood as well, and suddenly the small room felt even smaller with his presence filling it. "Margaret," he said, and her name in his deep voice sent a shiver through her. "I want you to know that I do not have any expectations beyond our business arrangement. I know there are people in town who talk, who wonder about us working together. If my being here is causing you difficulty or discomfort, I can step back, find someone else to manage the store." "No," the word came out too quickly, too forcefully. Margaret took a breath and continued more calmly. "No, please do not do that. I do not care what people say. You have given me my life back, Mason. Working with you, building something worthwhile, it has been the happiest I have been in years. I do not want that to end." Something flickered in his gray-blue eyes, something warm and intense that made her breath catch. He took a step closer, and she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that always seemed to cling to him. "I am glad," he said softly, "because these past months working beside you have been the best I have known too." They stood there in the lamplight, the air between them crackling with unspoken feelings. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears. She thought he might kiss her, hoped and feared it in equal measure. But Mason simply reached out and brushed his fingers against her hand, the gentlest of touches, before stepping back. "Good night, Margaret," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Good night," she whispered, and listened to his heavy footsteps descending the stairs. Winter came to Tucumcari with cold winds and occasional snow. The store did steady business, and Mason's reputation for fair dealing brought in customers from outlying ranches and homesteads. He proved to be more than just knowledgeable about trade goods. He was also skilled at negotiation, at reading people, at knowing when to hold firm on a price and when to bend. Margaret found herself learning from him daily, gaining confidence in her own judgment. They had fallen into an easy partnership that felt as natural as breathing. Mason often anticipated what Margaret needed before she asked. She learned to read his moods, knowing when his silence meant he was thinking through a problem, and when it meant something was troubling him. They worked side by side in comfortable quiet or easy conversation, and Margaret realized she had never experienced this kind of companionship before. Thomas had always been either overbearingly present or frustratingly absent, but never simply there in the steady, reliable way that Mason was. Christmas approached, and Margaret decided to decorate the store. She enlisted Mason's help in stringing evergreen branches along the counter and around the windows. He had gone into the foothills and cut the branches himself, returning with armfuls of fragrant pine and juniper. As they worked together, their hands brushing occasionally, Margaret felt a contentment that went bone deep. "I used to love Christmas when I was a child," she said, tying a red ribbon around a bundle of pine. "My mother would make special cookies, and my father would always find some little gift, even when money was tight. After they died, it never felt the same." Mason secured a branch above the door, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt. "My mother made these little carved ornaments," he said. "Animals mostly. She would hide them around the house, and my sister and I would search for them on Christmas morning. We would hang them on a tree my father cut." He was quiet for a moment. "I have not thought about that in years." "You still have any of the ornaments?" "A few." "Packed away with my things." He climbed down from the stool he had been standing on and looked at their handiwork. "This looks nice, welcoming." "We should have a tree," Margaret said impulsively. "A real one right here in the corner. It would make the store feel festive." Mason's rare smile appeared, transforming his face. "Then we will get a tree. I will cut one tomorrow." He was true to his word, returning the next afternoon with a beautiful pine tree that he set up in a corner of the store. Margaret clapped her hands in delight, and then felt embarrassed by her own enthusiasm. But Mason just looked pleased, his eyes warm as he watched her examine the tree from every angle. That evening, after they closed the store, Mason appeared at her door with a small wooden box. "I thought you might like these," he said, almost shyly. Inside were his mother's carved ornaments, a dozen small wooden animals worn smooth by time and handling. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes stinging with tears. "Mason, I cannot take these. They are precious to you." "I want you to have them," he said. "Or rather, I want us to use them for our tree." He paused, then added softly, "I think my mother would have liked that, would have liked you." They hung the ornaments together and then stood back to admire their work. The little wooden creatures seemed to dance in the lamplight, bringing life and warmth to the tree. Without thinking, Margaret slipped her hand into Mason's. His fingers closed around hers, large and warm and strong. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for saving me, for giving me hope again." Mason turned to face her, still holding her hand. His other hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. I have been trying to keep my feelings to myself, trying to be proper and respectful, but I cannot anymore. You need to know that I did not do all this just out of kindness or obligation." Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean that from the moment I walked into this store and saw you standing there, trying so hard to be brave when your world was falling apart, something in me recognized something in you. And these months working beside you, getting to know you, watching you laugh and seeing your strength and your goodness, I have fallen in love with you, Margaret Wallace, completely and irrevocably in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face now, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking. "I have been so afraid to admit it, afraid it was too soon, afraid you only saw me as a responsibility. But I love you, Mason Hughes. I love your kindness and your strength, and the way you make me feel safe and valued and seen." Mason made a sound that was half laugh, half groan, and then he was kissing her. His lips were gentle at first, questioning, but when Margaret responded with equal fervor, the kiss deepened. His arms came around her, pulling her against his broad chest, and she felt the solid strength of him, the heat of his body. She had never been kissed like this, with such tenderness and passion combined. Her hands tangled in his long hair, and she felt him shudder at her touch. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it has not been a year since Thomas died and people will talk, but I do not care. I want to spend my life with you, Margaret. I want to build a future together, a real partnership in every way." Margaret pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "People will always talk. They have been talking already, and I do not care either. I wasted 5 years in a marriage that was never a true partnership. I will not waste another moment when I could be with you. Yes, Mason, I will marry you." They were married 3 days after Christmas in a simple ceremony at the small church in Tucumcari. Margaret wore a new dress of deep blue wool that Mason had insisted on buying for her, and she carried a small bouquet of winter berries and evergreen. Mason wore a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but devastatingly handsome, his long hair neatly tied back. They spoke their vows with steady voices and shining eyes, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Mason's kiss was tender and full of promise. A few of the townspeople attended, those who had come to know and respect the unusual partnership that had saved the Wallace store and turned it into a thriving business. Mrs. Chen from the restaurant provided a wedding supper, and Mr. Peterson from the mercantile down the street played his fiddle. It was simple and modest, but to Margaret, it was perfect. That night, in the upstairs rooms that were now truly their home, Mason carried her over the threshold and set her down gently. "Are you happy?" he asked, his hands resting on her waist. "Happier than I have ever been," Margaret said truthfully. She reached up to untie his hair, letting it fall around his shoulders. "Are you nervous?" "I confess I am a little," he admitted. "I want to make you happy, Margaret. I want to be the husband you deserve." She took his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palms. "You already are, just by being you, by being honest and kind and true." Their wedding night was everything Margaret had never known it could be. Mason was gentle and patient, his large hands incredibly tender as he explored her body and helped her discover pleasures she had never imagined. Where Thomas had been quick and selfish, Mason was generous and attentive, seeming to find his own pleasure in hers. They came together with a passion that left Margaret breathless and amazed, and afterward, lying safe in his strong arms, she felt tears of gratitude slide down her cheeks. "Did I hurt you?" Mason asked immediately, concern in his voice. "No," she assured him, kissing his chest. "These are happy tears. I never knew it could be like this, that I could feel this way." His arms tightened around her. "We have all the time in the world to learn each other," he murmured against her hair. "This is just the beginning indeed." As 1879 dawned, Margaret and Mason settled into married life with surprising ease. They worked together in the store during the day, building on their success and expanding their inventory. Mason's knowledge of the wilderness and Margaret's understanding of what the townspeople needed proved to be a formidable combination. They began stocking items specifically for the ranchers and farmers in the area, and Margaret suggested a section for women's needs that quickly became popular. Mason proved to be an attentive and devoted husband. He brought Margaret small gifts from his trips into the countryside, a pretty stone, a bird's feather, wildflowers when the spring came. He listened to her ideas and respected her opinions. They disagreed sometimes, but they had learned to talk through their differences calmly, each willing to hear the other's perspective. It was a true partnership in every sense of the word. In March, Margaret began feeling ill in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she had eaten, but when the nausea persisted for more than a week, she began to suspect the truth. Mrs. Chen, who had become a friend, confirmed her suspicions with a knowing smile. "You are with child, dear," the older woman said. "I would wager you are about 2 months along." Margaret felt a rush of emotion so powerful she had to sit down. A baby. She was going to have Mason's baby. Joy and fear warred within her. She was 25 years old, and this would be her first child. What if something went wrong? What if she was not a good mother? But when she told Mason that evening, his reaction washed away her fears. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, wonder, and finally pure joy. He swept her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, searching his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I am amazed, grateful, terrified." She laughed through her tears. "I am terrified too." "We will figure it out together," Mason promised, "just like we have figured out everything else." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Mason became even more protective, insisting that Margaret rest more and not lift anything heavy. He hired a young man named Billy to help with the store, taking over many of the physical tasks that Margaret had previously handled. She protested at first, but secretly she was grateful. As her belly grew, she tired more easily. Summer brought sweltering heat to Tucumcari, and Margaret spent the hottest parts of the day resting upstairs while Mason and Billy handled the store. She used the time to sew baby clothes and prepare the small room next to their bedroom as a nursery. Mason built a beautiful cradle from pine, carving small animals into the headboard in imitation of his mother's ornaments. They talked about names endlessly. Mason wanted to name a son after Margaret's father if she would like that, and Margaret suggested Mason's father's name, Marcus, for a middle name. For a girl, they considered Margaret's mother's name, Elizabeth, and Mason's mother's name, Caroline. As autumn arrived and Margaret's time drew near, Mason became increasingly anxious. He hovered constantly, to the point where Margaret had to shoo him out of the house just to get some peace. But she loved him for his concern, for the way he treated her as precious and valuable. On a cool October evening, Margaret felt the first contractions. Mason immediately went for the midwife, Mrs. O'Connor, a capable woman who had delivered most of the babies in Tucumcari. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Mason stayed by Margaret's side as much as Mrs. O'Connor would allow, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry in the late afternoon of October 15th, 1879, Margaret and Mason wept together over the miracle of him. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and blue eyes that would likely change color in time. He had his father's strong features and his mother's delicate hands. "Samuel Marcus Hughes," Mason said softly, cradling his son for the first time. The baby looked impossibly tiny in his large hands, but he held him with infinite gentleness. "Welcome to the world, little man." Margaret watched her husband bond with their child, and her heart felt so full she thought it might burst. This was her family. This man who had walked into her darkest hour and given her not just financial security but love, partnership, and now this precious new life. She had gone from having nothing to having everything that mattered. The months after Samuel's birth were exhausting but joyful. Margaret marveled at how Mason took to fatherhood, helping with night feedings, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with a fussy baby so Margaret could sleep. He would sit for hours just watching Samuel sleep, his expression soft with wonder. "I cannot believe he is ours," he would say. "That we made this perfect little person." The store continued to thrive, with Billy proving to be a reliable employee who could handle things when Margaret and Mason needed to focus on their son. They hired a young woman named Sarah to help as well, particularly with tasks that required a woman's touch or knowledge. As 1880 arrived, and Samuel grew from a tiny infant into a curious, active baby, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed in just over 2 years. She had gone from a desperate widow with no future to a happily married woman with a thriving business and a beautiful son. And it was all because of the mountain man who had walked into her store and seen her worth when she could barely see it herself. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Samuel played with wooden blocks Mason had carved for him, Margaret leaned against her husband's shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, his arm coming around her. "About how grateful I am," she said. "About how you saved me in every way a person can be saved." Mason tilted her face up to his. "You saved me too," he said seriously. "I was living half a life, moving from place to place, never putting down roots. You gave me a home, Margaret. You gave me purpose and love and family." We saved each other. They kissed as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, their son babbling happily at their feet. It was a perfect moment, one of many they would share in the years to come. The years did pass, bringing changes and growth. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy with his father's build and his mother's quick mind. In 1882, Margaret gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth Caroline, who had her mother's delicate features and her father's gray-blue eyes. 2 years later, another son arrived, James Thomas, completing their family. The store expanded as Tucumcari grew. Mason bought the building next door and broke through the wall, doubling their space. They now carried everything from basic supplies to luxury items ordered from back east. Mason's reputation as an honest trader spread far beyond Tucumcari, and people came from miles around to do business with Hughes General Store. Margaret managed the books and the staff, which had grown to include 4 employees. She had a head for numbers and organization that complemented Mason's skills in negotiation and trading. Together, they built something substantial and lasting, a business that provided well for their family and employment for others. But more than the material success, they built a life rich in love and partnership. Mason never forgot where they had started, and he made sure Margaret knew daily that she was valued and cherished. He still brought her small gifts, still listened to her ideas with respect, still held her at night as if she were the most precious thing in his world. Margaret, in turn, made sure Mason knew that he was appreciated, that his strength and gentleness both had a place in their home. She encouraged him when business challenges arose, supported his decisions, and reminded him to take time for himself when he worked too hard. They raised their children with the same partnership. Mason was a devoted father, teaching his sons to ride and shoot and trap, but also teaching them to respect their mother and sister, to value honesty and hard work. Margaret taught all 3 children to read and write, to do sums, to think critically. Elizabeth proved to be particularly bright, with a hunger for learning that reminded Margaret of herself. Samuel, at age 10, was already helping in the store, learning the business from his parents. He had inherited his father's way with people and his mother's organizational skills. Little James, at 6, was still more interested in playing than working, but he showed signs of having an artistic bent, always drawing or building things. In 1888, when Margaret was 34 and Mason 42, they sat on their porch one summer evening after putting the children to bed. The store was closed for the night, the town quiet around them. Mason held Margaret's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Margaret asked. "If you had not walked into the store that day." Mason was quiet for a moment. "I try not to," he admitted. "It is too painful to imagine. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret. You and our children, this life we have built. I thank God every day that I happened to pass through Tucumcari when I did." "I was so lost," Margaret said softly, "so afraid. I could not see any way forward. And then you appeared like something out of a dream and you gave me everything. Hope, security, love. A real family." Mason turned to face her, his expression serious. "I did not give you those things, love. I gave you an opportunity, maybe. But you took it and ran with it. You made the store successful with your hard work and intelligence. You made our house a home with your warmth and love. You are an incredible mother and partner. Everything we have, we built together." Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. Even after all these years, he could still make her feel valued and seen in ways she had never experienced before him. "I love you so much," she whispered. "And I love you," he said, pulling her close. "More than I did yesterday, less than I will tomorrow." It was something he said often, and it never failed to make her smile. They sat together in the gathering darkness, comfortable in each other's presence, knowing they had years ahead of them to continue building their life together. Those years brought both joys and challenges, as all lives do. Samuel grew into a fine young man and took over more and more of the store's operations, showing a natural talent for business. At 20, he married a sweet girl named Anna from a nearby ranch, and they gave Margaret and Mason their first grandchildren, twin boys born in 1894. Elizabeth, brilliant and determined, wanted more education than Tucumcari could provide. At 16, she begged to be sent to a school for young women in Santa Fe. Mason was reluctant at first, wanting to keep his daughter close and safe, but Margaret convinced him to let Elizabeth spread her wings. "We raised her to think for herself," Margaret reminded him. "We cannot be surprised when she does exactly that." Elizabeth thrived in Santa Fe and eventually became a teacher, returning to Tucumcari to start a proper school. She married at 22, a newspaperman named David Preston who shared her passion for education and progress. James, their youngest, turned out to have a gift for woodworking and carving that surpassed even his father's skills. He apprenticed with a furniture maker in Albuquerque for several years before returning to Tucumcari to start his own shop. He married a quiet, artistic woman named Clara, and they had 3 daughters who all inherited their parents' creative talents. Through it all, Margaret and Mason remained each other's anchor. They celebrated successes together and weathered disappointments as a team. When Mason's health began to falter in his 60s, Margaret was there to care for him with the same devotion he had always shown her. When Margaret went through difficult years during her change of life, Mason was patient and understanding, never making her feel less than cherished. They eventually stepped back from the daily operations of the store, leaving it in Samuel's capable hands. This gave them time to enjoy their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to travel a bit, to simply be together without the demands of business constantly pulling at them. On a warm October evening in 1910, Margaret and Mason sat on the porch of the house they had lived in for over 30 years. Mason was 74 now, his dark hair gone mostly gray, his powerful body softened some by age but still strong. Margaret was 66, her face lined but still beautiful, her hair silver where it had once been dark brown. They watched the sunset together, as they had done countless times over the decades. Their hands were clasped together, fingers intertwined in a grip that had become second nature. 32 years, Margaret said softly. 32 years ago this month, I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left. Mason squeezed her hand. And look at what we built instead. 3 wonderful children, 8 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren so far. A successful business that will continue for generations. A good life full of love. All because you walked into a struggling store and saw a scared widow who needed help, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. All because a brave woman took a chance on a rough mountain man who did not know the first thing about settling down, Mason countered. You taught me how to be part of something bigger than myself, Margaret, how to be a husband and father, how to build a life worth living. Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him. We taught each other, she said. We built this together, every bit of it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the New Mexico sky in brilliant shades of red and gold. The store down the street showed lights in the windows, Samuel and Anna closing up for the night. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the laughter of children playing, probably some of their grandchildren. No regrets, Mason asked, as he had asked her so many times over the years. Not a single one, Margaret answered, as she always did. You gave me a future when I thought I had none. You gave me hope and love and family. You gave me everything. You gave me everything too, Mason said, kissing the top of her head. You are my heart, Margaret Hughes. You always have been from that very first day. As darkness fell softly over Tucumcari, they remained on the porch, 2 souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful and lasting. They had started with nothing but debt and desperation, and they had created a legacy of love that would endure for generations. The mountain man and the widow had saved each other, and in doing so, they had discovered that the most valuable things in life cannot be measured in dollars and cents. Love, partnership, family, and hope are treasures beyond price, and they had spent 32 years accumulating them in abundance. They would have many more years together, growing old side by side, watching their family continue to grow and flourish. And when their time finally came to leave this world, they would leave it together as they had done everything else, their hands clasped and their hearts forever intertwined. But on that October evening in 1910, they simply sat together in the peaceful darkness, grateful for every moment that had brought them to this place, every choice that had led them to each other. They had taken tragedy and debt and turned it into triumph and prosperity. They had taken loneliness and fear and transformed it into love and security. They had built a life together that was worth more than all the gold in the West, and they had done it one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. From the moment Mason Hughes walked into that struggling store and saw Margaret Wallace standing there with her world falling apart, their fates had been sealed. They were meant to find each other, meant to save each other, meant to build something beautiful together. And build it they had, creating not just a successful business but a family legacy, not just a marriage but a true partnership that had weathered every storm and celebrated every joy. They had proven that even in the harshest circumstances, hope could bloom. That even when everything seemed lost, love could light the way forward. As the stars began to appear in the vast New Mexico sky, Margaret and Mason Hughes sat together in perfect contentment, 2 hearts beating as one, 2 lives joined so completely that neither could imagine existence without the other. They had found their happily ever after not in spite of the hardships they had faced, but because of how they had faced them together. And that was the greatest treasure of all.